Well, thank you very much to the Friends of the BC Archives for this invitation. Second opportunity for me to talk about Fernie history. A lot of people I know in Fernie sometimes doubt that folks down at the coast actually know where Fernie is. I doubt very much if that's true of today, the people zooming in here today, but nevertheless, this first slide, I thought I'd include this anyway. As you can see, Fernie indeed is a very long way from the coast. What we're looking at here is coal country, 1915. If you can see Fernie there, the main community in the region, but that is coal country all the way from, if you can see Morrissey there, through Fernie, up through Sparwood, Natal, Michel, across into the Alberta border. Those are all coal mining communities. Fernie, of course, is the largest of them all. It's an administrative center as well as a mining center. Its mines are there at Coal Creek. And Michel, well, that is the home to Herman Elmer. We'll just run through a few quick slides here to show the region. The next slide, this is Fernie. That's the main street in Fernie, taken around, and in fact, I think precisely 1915. Looks like there's some event has just happened here. The town completely rebuilt after the fire of 1908 destroyed it completely. The next slide is Michel. Now, this is the home of Herman Elmer. It's the second community built around a mine by the Crow's Nest Pass Coal Company. They're at Coal Creek and Michel, with Fernie as the center. This next slide is another view, and let's just go straight to the next one, slide number 6. This is the view looking towards the Alberta border. You can see those little houses right out the back of the community of the big houses. And the next slide, this is the slide looking west. Sure if we've got that or not. Showing up here, right there, slide number 7. That's yes. That's looking east from the Tipple Bridge. That's the football pitch. There you see enclosed on the left. Ginger Goodwin played football there, but of course, that's a whole other story. And the next slide is the Vernon internment camp. Poor quality, I'm afraid. It's just a internet capture. This is where Herman Elmer found himself in October 1914. Now, that's a name that I first became aware of when I was doing my research for my book, Fernie at War. There was just a small report in the Fernie Free Press saying that Herman Elmer, secretary of the Michel local union, had been arrested for sedition. And then the Fernie Free Press report insisted rather bluntly that anyone sharing his views about the militia or the state of the war should share his fate. That's September 1914. Now, I've been tasked today to explains something of the archival search for information about Herman Elmer as I was trying to find out who he was, precisely why he was arrested, and what became of him. I hope to make it clear that it's a search that I could not have conducted without considerable help. 3 individuals, in fact, to whom I owe a great debt. Now, the first question becomes, who was Herman Elmer? And the answer to that question proves rather difficult to find. He's something of a mystery man. As this next slide shows, it's perhaps the only surviving photograph of Herman Elmer. His name first appears in very early 1912 in the Union newspaper. And here is where my first request for assistance went out to a friend in Calgary, Tom Langford. I know that the Crow's Nest Pass Coal Company has its records largely located at the Glenbow. And so I asked Tom if he would take a look in a particular file to see if Herman Elmer was there. Herman Elmer's initial employee record is not, but a second one is there when he returned to work after an accident in early 1912. Sorry, early 1913.
Wayne,
yes,
are we supposed to be seeing a photo of Herman Elmer right now? Because your slide does not have a photo; it just has a.
I know that's a bit of a joke. There is no photo.
Okay, sorry. I wasn't sure if it was an error or not. Thank you.
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay, sorry about that. Continue.
Okay. Anyway, the employee record shows Elmer returning to work in about May of 1913. So we've got him there as an employee of the Crow's Nest Pass Coal Company. As I say, he first shows up in the Union newspaper in 1912, but the Union officials are not too keen on him. He is he's writing letters to the paper, but they're refusing to publish him. Apparently, Elmer was favored the philosophy of the IWW, and that was certainly not in favor with United Mine Workers of America, District 18. So they refused to publish his letters. Doesn't seem to bother Mr. Elmer too much. He runs for president in 1912. Nothing like starting at the top, I suppose. He is handily defeated, but nevertheless, he wins the majority of the votes from his own local union at Michel, and he also wins 3 or 4 other local unions. That's 3 or 4 out of a total of, I think, roughly 18. Undeterred, in 1913, he runs for vice president, with largely the same result, although at Michel, for the vice presidential run, July 1913, he receives as many votes as all the other candidates combined who were running against him. Soon after that, he becomes the secretary for the Michel local union, and in that capacity seems to have made his peace somewhat with the union officials. He's very clear on his politics. He is favoring the proposal. In fact, the proposal came from his own local union to have District 18 adopt socialism as a constitutional basis for the union. He favored that strongly. He also favored a strike in District 18 to support the strike that was then going on in the Vancouver Island mines at Nanaimo, Wellington, Cumberland. With the outbreak of war, patriotic fervor changes everything, sweeping aside old beliefs, the old beliefs held by so many of the miners. The 107th East Kootenay Militia is marching on one Sunday afternoon in late, drilling I should say, one Sunday afternoon late in September, at the same time that a union meeting is being held in Michel. At that union meeting, two questions are asked of Herman Elmer. One has to do with the report that the BC Federation of Labour is considering expelling union members who join militias. That has everything to do with the Vancouver Island strike. And he's asked, Elmer's reply to that is, yes, it is being considered. And he's asked a second question concerning the war. And to that question, Elmer simply states what is union policy of the time, which is that they see no reason why the working men of one country should be quarreling or fighting with working men of another. Elmer said, I favor no particular nation in this current war. Now, in July 1914, those statements wouldn't have raised an eyebrow, but in September, as I say, things have changed. And the reason, this is where circumstance and coincidence conspire against Herman Elmer. And just showing how much things have changed. The next slide, it has very much to do with the fact that this man is in town. Major William Ridgway Wilson. Now, this is a very early photograph, pilfered from Donald Luxton's book. At the time, William Ridgway Wilson is in his 60s, and he has been appointed as the officer in charge of what they called the Department of Alien Reservists. Military District 11 has given him that appointment. And in that capacity, he's already set up 2 internment camps, one at Nanaimo and one at Vernon. He's in Fernie at the end of September to speak to the provincial police about a new regulation, a provincial regulation requiring all enemy aliens to register with provincial police. A word more perhaps about Major William Ridgway Wilson. He was a Victoria architect, very well connected in Conservative Party circles, which, as we know, were the ones that really counted then. He was commissioned to build the Wilkinson Road Jail and the Bay Street Armory, both around this time. I'll say a little more about him later. Knowing Wilson was in town, 2 union members, 2 members who had been at the meeting where Elmer had answered those questions, traveled to Fernie and told Major Wilson what had been said. Wilson immediately ordered that Elmer be arrested for sedition. Hence the report in the Fernie Free Press that first made me aware of Herman Elmer. Now, I wanted to find out more about this if I could. Well, it seems a rather sparse tale to this point, arrested on hearsay evidence, and that's all there is to it. But that was all there was to it. I went into the BC archives, our favorite, of course, to see what could be found there. Unfortunately, very little, but there is in the BC Provincial Police a report by the arresting officer, the officer who went to Michel to arrest Herman Elmer. He seems to be taking credit for the arrest. Of course, it was not his idea, as he suggested. It was at the order of Major Wilson. So a bewildered Herman Elmer is brought down to Fernie, kept in the provincial jail for a short time, and then taken to Vernon in very early October. Now, knowledge of the internment camps is certainly beyond my level of competence, but again, here comes a second assistant, a very, very helpful man at Vernon. Don McNair is his name. And he went to considerable time and effort trying to find out what he could, or to share with me what he could find about Herman Elmer, and it was very little. Herman Elmer is barely mentioned in the records at the Vernon internment camp, and never in a way to suggest he was causing any trouble. And he's basically, there he is. He spends 5 years in that camp. October 1914 was the first of 5 Octobers that Elmer would spend there. It's a military arrest. There is no trial or hearing of any kind. And the years go on, the patriotic fervor continues, or sometimes just cloaking other activities under the guise of patriotism. We could look at slide 11 here. A year after Elmer's arrest, again, this has so much to do with the Vancouver Island coal strike and its aftermath, but this is a photo taken at Fernie, where the Fernie miners, having heard of the arrest of miners on Vancouver Island, went on strike to demand, that is to say, the arrest of enemy alien miners on Vancouver Island, went on strike to demand the same at Fernie. Ironically, they were about to get the same. Attorney General William Bowser had plans to do that, but they kind of jumped the gun. This photo is taken June 1915, and it's interesting to think that had Elmer not been arrested a year earlier, he would have been in this photograph as the miners from Michel and Coal Creek, any mining employee of the Crow's Nest Pass Coal Company, not a naturalized British subject and an enemy alien, was interned at this point. It's a story that has everything to do with William Bowser as Attorney General, with the provincial police. Major Wilson actually is bypassed by this at this particular event at Fernie. It's the provincial police. These are special agents that you see at the sides, standing to attention with their rifles at the ready, taken on for this specific purpose. It's a complicated story. It's a very complicated story. I like to think I have finally figured it out and finally laid it out clearly in Fernie at War. a book still available at fine bookstores everywhere, I must add. When I say he was forgotten, I mean, when I say Elmer was forgotten, he was not entirely. In fact, the next slide is David Rees. He has been long associated with union activity in the region with the Coal Creek local union. He is the international board member for the United Mine Workers. And he heads two attempts to have Elmer released in 1914, 1915. He, the first on behalf of District 18, the second in conjunction with the BC Federation of Labor. On both occasions, military officials say they see no reason to release Herman Elmer. Time goes on, the war goes on. Elmer stays in Vernon, by this time clearly having lost his initial hopes that he could be out soon. This next slide, I include this for a number of reasons. First, it's the only one I have in color. Secondly, I was delighted to have tracked this down and then disappointed it did not find its way into the book Fernie at War. So an opportunity to show it here, I thought I would. It's just another indication of all activity seems to be focused on the war. The IODE did considerable Red Cross work in Fernie. In fact, they were responsible for Red Cross work in Fernie during the First World War and campaigned for the Union candidate in the Khaki election. It's patriotism conquers all. And then war ends. It's 1919 for slide 14. This, I want to just change a bit what I'm saying here. It's 1919. Herman Elmer has been at Vernon for 5 years. This is a photograph of German internees leaving Vernon. We don't know if Herman Elmer is in this photograph. They all have their backs to us, unfortunately. But he's finally on his way out of Vernon. And at this point, well, I should mention, this photo is courtesy of Andrea Lister, until very recently editor of BC History magazine. Here, I must mention the third individual who helped me out so much on this. I have mentioned John McNair in Vernon, and in Fernie, Dan St. Marie had, when I was trying to find out things about Herman Elmer, had recently been awarded a research grant from the First World War Internment Recognition Fund to do a book on the Morrissey internment camp, and he was heading to Ottawa. Well, I asked him if he could take a look at one particular file I knew of in Record Group 13, Department of Justice, and to keep his eye open for anything at all. And he did indeed come up with some valuable information. If we could skip ahead just 2 slides here, go to number 16. That takes us back to David Rees. In 1914, he had tried his best to have Elmer released. And in 1919, He is now a vice president of the Canadian Trades and Labor Congress. And in that capacity, he makes a third attempt. And these documents are found in the National Archives and came to my attention thanks very much to Dan St. Marie. Now, what happens here is that Rees has written to the Department of Justice, laying out the reasons that Herman Elmer could now be released now that the war is over. The Department of Justice, in turn, has contacted Sir William Otter, in charge of internment operations, and Otter just happens to have on his desk a report from the officer in charge of the Vernon internment camp. And that report identifies just about everybody at Vernon as, and I quote here, undesirable, troublesome, or unwanted. Elmer is one of those identified as being of the class termed IWW. Now, again, this is coincidence and circumstance conspiring against Herman Elmer for the second time. The focus of internment operations by 1919 had shifted towards labor radicals and revolutionaries. The term IWW is broadly used to describe anybody of that ilk. It doesn't necessarily mean that Elmer is still a supporter of the IWW, but it does suggest that he's maintained his principles about the working men of one country should not be fighting the working men of another, the principles about industrial unionism, etc. Accordingly, if we go back to number 14 now, to the slide of the Germans leaving Vernon, the appeal was again rejected. Elmer is not going to be released. In fact, he's identified as one of 100 individuals in camps, internment camps across the country, who are going to be deported even before the formal peace treaty with Germany is concluded. On March 4th, 1919, he and his fellow deportees leave St. John, New Brunswick for Liverpool, just as there had been no appeal, no due process for him in 1914, there was again none in 1919. Now, there was very little publicity for all this, for the deportation. I don't know if news of Elmer's deportation at that time reached Michel or Fernie. What's going on precisely at this time in early 1919 is a great agitation from returned soldiers to deport all enemy aliens. That debate is raging in Fernie at the time, and the next slide shows one individual who is opposing that tide as best he can. Thomas Uphill in 1919 is the mayor of Fernie. He's not making himself too popular by saying that no one should be deported unless there can be shown to be reasonable grounds for needing to do so. The next slide, David Rees. I just mention him again because in May and June, he is swept up in the debate for the one big union strike that will occupy everything in the district from May to July. He is an opponent of that strike. But the next slide shows that patriotism, the expressions of patriotism are still, are what can still animate people the most. This is the Peace Day celebration in Fernie, the Victory Queen being crowned. I can't really even be sure where she is in here. This scene is reminiscent of scenes in Fernie where crowds gather to send off the troop trains in the early months of the war. Enthusiasm is palpable. 1919, quite the year. That year, the next slide, now Lieutenant Colonel William Ridgway Wilson, he's nearing the end of his responsibilities with internment operations. He was in charge in British Columbia after the federal government took over internment matters. His architecture, of course, is still visible in Victoria, not just the armory and the jail, but in other locations. But his military career, there are but scraps remaining. They do tend to indicate that Wilson, I'm not sure how to say this exactly, in the course of doing his job, he demonstrated that when it came to German prisoners, when it came to anyone with a German name, in fact, he was less than keen to give them a break. Maybe I should say that. I can only speculate why he arrested Elmer so quickly, but in subsequent years, he didn't want a man with a German name leading the band at the Vernon internment camp. He wanted another gentleman with a German name, a British subject, but with a German name, to leave the Morrissey camp, and then he wouldn't let the YMCA keep the record player that the man had brought in. I think all I'm trying to say is that Wilson was as zealous in his pursuit of what he believed as Elmer was in his. As for Elmer, the last slide, I think I've said, this is a more recent photograph. I think I've said just about all I can about him. Don McNair at Vernon let me know that Elmer was born in a small coastal village in northern Germany. Hardly a circumstance that you would think would lead to being a coal miner in Michel in 1912, 1913, 1914. I think that there must be much more to the Elmer story before he arrives at Michel. Undoubtedly, there's more after as well, but I've not been able to come up with any information about him once he is returned to Germany in the spring of 1919. I hope I've made it clear that the archival research was very much spread out. Tom Langford in Calgary, Don McNair in Vernon, and his research, by the way, has resulted in a booklet about the Vernon internment camp. Dan St. Marie in Fernie, I look forward to his forthcoming book very much. my own interest in all this, basically twofold. I am fascinated by Fernie history. I think it's been neglected for far too long. It doesn't really fit into the patterns of BC history. Maybe the folks in Fernie are right. It just is too far from the universities here at the coast. And secondly, Herman Elmer, there were approximately 8,500 interned enemy aliens in Canada during the Great War. Most of them were from the eastern areas of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and most of them were interned largely because they were poor. About a quarter of the 8,000 were German, and each of these individuals has a story. Herman Elmer is just one of them. Well, thank you, and thanks again for the invitation to let me blab on about this. I hope to be able to answer any questions that there may be.
That's great. Thanks, Wayne.